There are secrets that sleep in the stone walls of palaces, whispers of desire so dangerous they tore apart the very fabric of faith. And in the shadowed corridors of Tudor England, one young woman's eyes met those of a king and set into motion a chain of events that would shatter a dynasty, birth a new church, and end with her own blood staining the scaffold at the Tower of London. This is not a fairy tale of love conquering all, but the true story of Anne Boleyn, a girl barely past childhood who learned to wield her beauty and intellect like weapons in a world where women were possessions, where queens were discarded like worn gowns, and where one misstep, one whispered accusation, could mean the difference between a crown and a grave. Before we journey into the heart of this forbidden affair that changed England forever, I want to ask you something from my heart to yours. If you're finding this story as captivating as I do in the telling of it, would you take just a moment to press the like button below and subscribe to this channel? We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins us means the world. It tells me that these stories of royal women, their hidden lives, their sacrifices, and their strength matter to you as much as they matter to me. So please, stay with us, and let's uncover these buried histories together. Now, let us step back into the year 1526, to an England that Americans today can scarcely imagine, a nation where the Catholic Church held dominion over every soul, where the Pope's word was law even above kings, and where a woman's value was measured entirely by her ability to produce male heirs. Henry VIII sat upon the throne of England, a king who in his youth had been called the handsomest prince in Christendom, with his golden hair and athletic build, a man who wrote poetry and music, who jousted with vigor and ruled with an iron confidence that came from never having been told no, not once in his entire life. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who had first been wed to Henry's older brother Arthur, and after Arthur's untimely death, had been passed to Henry in a marriage designed to keep the Spanish alliance intact. But after nearly 2 decades of marriage, Catherine had given Henry only one living child, a daughter named Mary, and in the rigid patriarchal structure of 16th century monarchy, a daughter was not enough. A daughter could not inherit the throne securely, could not command armies, could not be taken seriously by the male rulers of Europe who would see a queen regnant as weakness incarnate. Henry's desperation for a son had become an obsession that consumed him, and into this volatile mixture of royal frustration and masculine pride walked Anne Boleyn, and nothing would ever be the same again. But who was Anne Boleyn before she became the most controversial queen England had ever known? Before her name became synonymous with seduction and scandal, before reformers hailed her as a Protestant martyr, and Catholics condemned her as a witch and a whore? She was born sometime around 1501 or 1507. Historians still debate her exact birth year, into a family of ambitious minor nobility. The Boleyns were not ancient aristocracy, but rather newly elevated. Gentry who had climbed the social ladder through strategic marriages and service to the crown. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat and courtier, a man who understood that his daughters could be valuable assets in the great game of court politics. And so Anne was sent abroad for her education, first to the Netherlands and then to France, where she served in the household of Queen Claude and absorbed the sophisticated, cultured atmosphere of the French court. The France of the early 1500s was a revelation compared to England. It was a place where women like Marguerite of Navarre wrote poetry and theology, where courtly love was elevated to an art form, where wit and conversation mattered as much as beauty. And Anne soaked it all in like a sponge, learning to speak French fluently, to dance with grace, to play the lute and sing, to dress with impeccable style, and most importantly, to engage in the intricate verbal sparring that was the currency of court flirtation. When she returned to England around 1522, she was no longer the girl who had left. She was a woman transformed, dark-eyed and slender, where the ideal English beauty was fair and plump, sharp-tongued and confident, where women were expected to be demure and submissive, and she stood out at Henry's court like a raven among doves. It's crucial to understand that Anne did not set out to seduce a king, at least not at first. When she arrived back at the English court, she was simply one of many ladies in waiting, young women whose job was to attend upon Queen Catherine, to embroider and gossip and make the Queen's chambers a pleasant place. And Anne had every expectation of making a good marriage to some suitable nobleman and living out her life in relative comfort and obscurity. She had even formed an attachment to Henry Percy, the son of the Earl of Northumberland, a young man who seemed genuinely smitten with her, and there are indications that they may have even entered into a pre-contract of marriage, which in the legal understanding of the time was nearly as binding as marriage itself. But when Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, discovered this budding romance, he intervened with brutal efficiency. Percy was sent away, the relationship was crushed, and Anne was left humiliated and heartbroken, forced to watch as the man she may have actually loved was married off to someone else to suit the political conveniences of powerful men. This moment was formative for Anne. It taught her that in the world she inhabited, women had no control over their own destinies, that love was a luxury the powerful could not afford, and the powerless were not permitted. And perhaps it was this lesson that hardened something inside her, that made her decide that if she was to be used as a pawn in men's games, she would at least play to win. Henry first noticed Anne sometime around 1525 or 1526, and what drew him to her was precisely what made her different from every other woman at court. She did not simper or flatter or make herself available. She challenged him intellectually, debated with him about religion and politics, kept him at arm's length even as other women threw themselves at the king, hoping to become the next royal mistress. You see, Henry had already had an affair with Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn, a liaison that had been conducted with the discreet tolerance that royal courts extended to a king's extramarital adventures. Mary had been compliant, undemanding, and ultimately forgettable, just another in a long line of women who had warmed the king's bed and then faded back into obscurity. But Anne refused to follow that script. She had seen what happened to royal mistresses, how they were used and discarded, how they might receive some minor gifts or favors, but never real power, never security. And she made a calculated decision that if the king wanted her, he would have to offer her something no other mistress had ever demanded. He would have to make her his wife, his queen, the mother of his legitimate heirs. This was audacious to the point of madness. Henry was already married. Catholic doctrine held that marriage was a sacrament that could not be dissolved, and Anne was not a foreign princess with armies and alliances behind her. She was merely the daughter of a minor nobleman, but she held firm to her refusal, and in doing so, she transformed herself from potential mistress to obsession. The letters Henry wrote to Anne during their courtship, 17 of which survive though Anne's responses have been lost to history, reveal a man utterly consumed by desire and frustration. He called her his darling, his sweetheart. He sent her gifts of game he had killed in the hunt. He wrote to her in a mixture of English and French, sometimes including little drawings of hearts, and his and her initials intertwined. And most tellingly, he promised her again and again that he would find a way to make her his wife, that his marriage to Catherine could be annulled, that they would be together legitimately, and their sons would inherit his throne. For a modern audience, especially Americans accustomed to divorce being a commonplace legal procedure, it can be difficult to grasp just how revolutionary and dangerous Henry's intentions were. But in 1527, when Henry first approached the Pope seeking an annulment of his marriage to Catherine, he was asking for something that struck at the very heart of Catholic authority. He was claiming that his marriage had never been valid because Catherine had previously been married to his brother, and though the Pope had granted a dispensation allowing that marriage in the first place, Henry now argued that no pope had the authority to overrule the biblical prohibition against marrying one's brother's widow. The theological and legal arguments were complex, involving interpretations of Scripture from the book of Leviticus, questions about whether Catherine's first marriage had been consummated, and the political reality that Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose armies had recently sacked Rome and who had no intention of allowing his aunt to be humiliated and cast aside by the English king. While Henry maneuvered through the labyrinthine politics of annulment, Anne waited, and the waiting must have been excruciating. She was in her mid-20s now, no longer young by the standards of her time, and she had gambled everything on Henry's ability to deliver on his promises. She could not afford to give in to his physical demands, because the moment she did, she would lose her bargaining power. She would become just another mistress, and yet she had to keep him interested enough that he would continue fighting for her. It was a tightrope walk that required nerves of steel and a clear understanding of male desire and ego. She managed this delicate balance through a combination of carefully calibrated intimacy and denial. She would allow Henry certain liberties, kisses, and caresses that inflamed him but stopped short of consummation. She would write him letters that were affectionate but not quite committal, and she would occasionally retreat from court when his pressure became too intense, knowing that absence would only increase his longing. Meanwhile, the court watched this drama unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Catherine's supporters saw Anne as an ambitious harlot who had bewitched the king, while others recognized that Anne was merely doing what any intelligent woman in her position would do, using the only power available to her, the power of withheld consent, to negotiate for a better position in a world stacked entirely against her gender. The years dragged on. 1527 became 1528, then 1529, and still the Pope refused to grant the annulment. Catherine maintained with unshakable dignity that her marriage to Henry was valid and that she was England's true queen, and the entire nation seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. Anne's position became increasingly uncomfortable. She was living at court as the king's acknowledged favorite, but without the title or protection that marriage would bring, she was the target of vicious gossip and even threats. There were rumors that Catherine's supporters wanted her dead, that she would be poisoned or assassinated, and the strain must have been enormous, yet she held firm, and gradually, as the Pope continued to delay and obstruct, Henry began to listen to a more radical solution being whispered by a new generation of advisors, men like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, who had been influenced by the Protestant Reformation sweeping through Germany and Switzerland. What if England simply broke away from Rome altogether? What if Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England and granted his own annulment? It was an idea that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, but desperation and desire have a way of making the impossible seem not only feasible but necessary. The break with Rome, which Americans would later study as one of the pivotal moments in Western history, the event that created the Anglican Church and set England on a separate religious path from Catholic Europe, was not driven by deep theological conviction or spiritual crisis. It was driven by a king's obsession with a dark-eyed woman who refused to sleep with him until he made her his queen. And by 1532, Henry had decided he would wait no longer. He and Anne began appearing. Together openly, she was given royal apartments and treated with the deference due to a queen. And at some point, likely in December of 1532, Anne finally gave in to Henry's desires. Perhaps she calculated that Henry was now too publicly committed to her to back out. Perhaps she genuinely believed that marriage was imminent, or perhaps after 6 years of holding out, she was simply exhausted and in love with the idea of finally securing her future. By January of 1533, Anne was pregnant, and this changed everything if the child was a boy, and if that boy was to be legitimate heir to the throne, Anne had to be married to Henry immediately. And so, in a secret ceremony on January 25, 1533, Anne Boleyn became Henry's wife, even though his marriage to Catherine had still not been officially annulled, even though the Pope had not sanctioned it, even though by the laws of the Catholic Church this was not a marriage at all but adultery and bigamy. Over the coming months, the machinery of state moved to legitimize what had already been done. Henry's Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared the marriage to Catherine invalid. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making Henry supreme head of the Church of England. And on June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She processed through the streets of London in a litter hung with white cloth of gold, her dark hair loosed down her back, as was traditional for queens at their coronation, and she was visibly pregnant, her belly swelling with what everyone assumed would be the prince England had been waiting for. The imperial ambassador reported that the crowds watching the procession were sullen and disapproving, that when Anne passed, few people called out blessings or good wishes, and this was an ominous sign because Anne's elevation had come at tremendous cost. The break with Rome had torn England apart. Families were divided between those who accepted the new religious order and those who remained loyal to the Pope, and men like Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, would go to their deaths, rather than acknowledge Anne as queen or Henry as head of the Church. Anne was loved by reformers who saw her as a champion of the new Protestant faith. She had genuinely read the Bible in English, she supported preachers and scholars who advocated for church reform, and she used her influence to promote men who shared these views. But to traditionalists, she was the cause of all England's troubles, the woman who had seduced the king away from his true wife, from the true faith, and from Rome. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth, and in a crushing disappointment that must have sent ice through her veins. The child was a girl, not the promised prince, not the son for whom England had broken with Rome, and Henry had overturned the world, but a daughter who was named Elizabeth, and who would one day become the greatest monarch England ever knew. But in that moment, in the birthing chamber, as Anne heard her baby's first cries and saw the disappointment on the faces of the attendants, she must have understood that her position had just become desperately precarious. Henry had upended his kingdom for a son, and she had given him another daughter, just like Catherine. The king put on a show of accepting the situation gracefully. Elizabeth was after all legitimate and healthy, and Anne was still young. There would be other pregnancies, other chances for sons, but something had shifted in the dynamic between them. The first crack had appeared in the foundation of their relationship, and it would only widen with time. The next 3 years of Anne's queenship were marked by increasing tension and tragedy. She suffered at least 2 miscarriages, one in the summer of 1534 and another in January of 1536, and this latter miscarriage was particularly devastating because the fetus was male. The son that might have secured Anne's position forever was lost, and Henry's reaction was cold and cruel. He told her that he now saw that God would not give him male children with her, implying that their marriage, like his marriage to Catherine before it, was somehow cursed or invalid. Anne's situation was made more difficult by her own personality. She had never learned to be the submissive, decorative queen that Henry's vision of queenship required. She argued with him about policy and religion. She had a sharp tongue and a quick temper. She made enemies easily among the conservative faction at court, who resented her religious views and her hold over the king. And as Henry's passion for her cooled, as it inevitably would after years of marriage and the disappointments of failed pregnancies, she found herself increasingly isolated. The court whispered that Henry was already looking at other women, particularly Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale, submissive lady in waiting who was everything Anne was not, and Anne, desperate to hold on to her position, sometimes resorted to tactics that would later be used against her. She was flirtatious with the men of the court. She allowed a circle of male courtiers to pay her elaborate courtly attentions, and in the pressure cooker environment of the Tudor court, where every word and gesture was watched and interpreted, this behavior could easily be twisted into something sinister. By the spring of 1536, Henry had decided that he wanted to be rid of Anne. Exactly why remains one of history's great questions. Was it simply that he was tired of her and wanted to marry Jane Seymour? Was it that he genuinely believed she had betrayed him? Or was it, as seems most likely, a combination of political expediency, personal disappointment, and the machinations of Anne's enemies at court who saw an opportunity to destroy her? Thomas Cromwell, who had once been Anne's ally, turned against her, perhaps because she had opposed some of his policies, perhaps because he saw which way the wind was blowing, and chose to align himself with the king's desires rather than loyalty to a queen whose influence was waning. And in late April of 1536, Cromwell set in motion a prosecution that would be shocking even by the standards of Tudor ruthlessness. Anne was arrested and charged with adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George Boleyn, charges that also included treason because adultery by a queen was considered treason since it potentially threatened the legitimacy of the royal succession. The specific accusations were lurid and detailed, claiming that Anne had seduced these men, that she had conspired with them to murder the king, and that she had mocked the king's sexual abilities and impotence, which, given Henry's vanity, was perhaps the most damaging accusation of all. The men accused alongside Anne were arrested and tortured, not physically in most cases, but through the psychological pressure of interrogation and the promise of lenient treatment. If they confessed, Mark Smeaton, a musician at court, was the only one to confess to adultery with the queen, and his confession was almost certainly obtained through coercion or torture, or the promise that his life would be spared if he cooperated. The other men, including Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Anne's own brother George, maintained their innocence even under interrogation. But in the legal system of the time, evidence was a flexible thing, and when the Crown wanted a conviction would be obtained. Anne herself was taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where she had stayed in splendor 3 years earlier before her coronation. But now she entered through the Traitor's Gate as a prisoner accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and the constable of the tower later reported that she alternated between moments of dignified composure and bouts of hysterical laughter and weeping. which, given the circumstances, seems a perfectly reasonable response to finding oneself facing execution for crimes one did not commit. Where were you when you first learned about Anne Boleyn's story, and what do you think you would have done in her position, faced with the choice between remaining powerless or gambling everything for a chance at the crown? Would you have made the same choice she did, knowing how it ended? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching this from, and whether you think Anne was a victim of her circumstances or an ambitious woman who knew the risks she was taking. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Anne was tried by a jury of her peers, which included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, men who had been selected because they would deliver the verdict the king wanted. And on May 15, 1536, she was found guilty and sentenced to death, either by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a final gesture of what he perhaps thought was mercy, commuted the sentence to beheading and imported an expert swordsman from Calais to perform the execution, because he wanted Anne's death to be quick and clean. In the days between her sentencing and execution, Anne composed herself with remarkable courage and dignity. She heard Mass, she prepared her soul, and she dictated a letter to Henry, proclaiming her innocence one final time. Though there is no evidence he ever read it or cared about its contents, he was already planning his marriage to Jane Seymour, already mentally erasing Anne from his life and his history, already rewriting the narrative to make himself the victim who had been deceived by a cunning and manipulative woman rather than the tyrant who had murdered his wife to make room for a new one. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked out onto the scaffold erected on Tower Green. She was dressed in a grey damask gown trimmed with fur. Her hair was loose and covered with a simple white coif, and the lieutenant of the Tower later wrote that he had seen many men die, but had never seen anyone meet death with greater courage. She made a brief speech in which she did not protest her innocence, probably because she had been warned that her daughter Elizabeth's future welfare depended on her going quietly. She said she was prepared to die and asked the crowd to pray for the king. Then she knelt and removed her headdress, and a woman who had been standing nearby quickly blindfolded her, and Anne began to pray aloud, repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul," over and over. And the swordsman came forward, moving silently on the straw that had been scattered across the scaffold. And with a single stroke of the sword, Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body. She was somewhere between 28 and 32 years old. She had been queen for 1,000 days, and she died not for any crime she had actually committed, but because a king's desire had turned to indifference and then to murderous expediency, because she had failed to produce a male heir, and because in the world of Tudor England, a queen who had outlived her usefulness could be disposed of as easily as any other inconvenient woman. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, Henry was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour, and they were married 11 days later. Erasing Anne from history with indecent haste, her marriage to Henry was annulled, which meant that Elizabeth, like Mary before her, was declared illegitimate and bastardized, stripped of her title as princess and reduced to merely the Lady Elizabeth, and Anne was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower walls, her coffin a roughly constructed arrow chest, because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. So completely was it assumed that her death would happen, and that she would need to be disposed of quickly and without ceremony. For centuries afterward, historians and storytellers have debated Anne Boleyn's guilt or innocence, with most modern scholars concluding that the charges against her were entirely fabricated, that she was the victim of a judicial murder orchestrated by a king who wanted to be free to marry again, and by courtiers who saw her destruction as politically advantageous. The evidence presented at trial was circumstantial at best and contradictory at worst. The timeline of her supposed affairs included dates when she was either pregnant or recently delivered of a child and unlikely to be engaging in sexual activity, and the accusation of incest with her brother was so grotesque that even by the standards of the time, it seemed designed to maximize public revulsion and justify the death penalty. But focusing solely on Anne's guilt or innocence misses the larger tragedy of her story, which is not whether she slept with these men or not, but that as a woman in the Tudor court, she had no real power to control her own fate. From the moment she returned to England from France, she was a pawn in games played by men. Her father used her to advance the family's fortunes. Henry used her to satisfy his desires and his desperate need for a son. Cromwell used her destruction to solidify his own. political position, and even in death, she was used by Protestant reformers who made her into a martyr for their cause, and by Catholic polemicists who made her into a cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition and sexual transgression. Anne had tried to play the game as well as any woman could. She had used her intelligence and her sexuality strategically. She had refused to be just another forgotten mistress, and for a few years, she had achieved what seemed impossible. She had become Queen of England. She had broken the power of Rome over the English Church. She had given birth to a daughter who would one day rule with a brilliance that surpassed any English monarch before or since. But in the end, the system that elevated her also destroyed her, because in a patriarchal monarchy, a woman's power is always borrowed, always contingent, always subject to being revoked the moment she ceases to be useful to the men who truly hold control. The irony that Americans and indeed people around the world have long appreciated is that Anne Boleyn's legacy far exceeded anything Henry achieved. He wanted a son, and he got one, Edward, from his third wife, Jane Seymour. But Edward died young, and it was Anne's daughter Elizabeth who would rule England for 45 years, who would defeat the Spanish Armada, who would preside over a golden age of English culture and exploration, and who would never marry, perhaps because she had learned, from her mother's fate, that marriage for a queen meant surrendering control, meant becoming vulnerable to the whims of a husband and to the dangers of childbirth. And Elizabeth chose instead to marry England itself, to remain the Virgin Queen, untouchable and autonomous in a way her mother never was. When Victorian historians and American audiences in the 19th and 20th centuries became fascinated with Tudor history, Anne Boleyn captured the imagination in a way that Catherine of Aragon or Jane Seymour never quite did, perhaps because her story contained all the elements of tragic drama, forbidden love, political intrigue, religious revolution, and a woman who tried to seize control of her own destiny in a world designed to prevent exactly that. Newspapers in New York and Boston in the 1800s ran serialized accounts of Anne's life. Plays were written about her, novels were penned, and she became a symbol of female ambition and its tragic consequences. Interpreted by some as a cautionary tale about women who reach too high, and by others as an indictment of the male power structures that punish women for daring to want anything beyond what men decide to give them. In the end, standing in the shadow of history and looking back at Anne Boleyn's brief and blazing trajectory across the Tudor court, what strikes deepest is not the question of her guilt or innocence, not even the religious and political upheaval her relationship with Henry caused, but rather the essential loneliness and terror of her position. Imagine being her in those final days in the Tower, knowing that the man you had loved, or at least the man you had gambled everything on, was preparing to watch you die, knowing that your daughter would grow up without you, that your name would be blackened, that everything you had sacrificed and schemed and suffered for would be taken away as easily as a king signs his name to a death warrant. Imagine the cold stone walls of that cell, the sound of the scaffold being constructed outside your window, the knowledge that no one was coming to save you because in the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, you had become more valuable dead than alive. And yet Anne did not beg or grovel. She did not give Henry the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. She walked to her death with her head high, and in doing so, she claimed the only power left to her, the power of how she would be remembered in that final moment, not as the hysterical adulteress of the crown's propaganda, but as a woman who had dared to reach for a crown and who faced the consequences of that daring with a courage that even her enemies had to acknowledge. The teenage girl who had once caught a king's eye and changed the course of English history died alone and condemned, but her story lived on and continues to live on, as a reminder that behind every royal mistress, every scandalous affair, every whispered secret in palace corridors, there was a real woman with hopes and fears and dreams, a woman who existed in a world that gave her almost no choices and then punished her for the choices she made. And perhaps that is why these stories still matter to us today, why we still gather to listen to them, because they remind us how recently in human history women were treated as possessions rather than people, and how much courage it took for women like Anne Boleyn to try to write their own stories in a world determined to write those stories for them.